Welcome to Cherry Blossom BL Story, where emotions bloom and stories unfold. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's chapter. Elliot's quiet life shattered the moment a knock echoed through his apartment, and his brother Noah's reckless mistakes dragged him into the world of Dante Vieira, the Mafia boss who ruled with fear. Taken as leverage to force Noah into paying a dangerous debt, Elliot's world spirals into chaos. Now trapped in Dante's mansion, with every move watched and every word weighed, Elliot must decide. Will he stay and face the cold, calculating kingpin who holds him captive, or will he risk everything to save the brother who betrayed him? As dark secrets unravel, Elliot finds himself tangled in a web of power, betrayal, and an unexpected connection with the man who has imprisoned him. Chapter 1: The Reckoning. Elliot had always prided himself on his ability to keep everything in his life organized, manageable. He had taken on the role of caretaker for his younger brother, Noah, since their parents had passed away. While Noah was impulsive and reckless, Elliot had always been the steady hand, the protector. It wasn't the life Elliot had envisioned for himself, but it was the life he had accepted. Until that day, it had started like any other day. Elliot had been working late in his small office, the hum of the computer the only sound that filled the otherwise quiet apartment. He was planning his next step toward leaving the city. He'd secured an internship at a firm across the state, and though it wasn't glamorous, it was a new beginning. The thought of finally breaking free from the constant weight of responsibility was comforting, but he hadn't told Noah yet. He didn't want to leave him in the same chaos, even if Noah seemed oblivious to the danger. But just as Elliot had begun to close his laptop for the night, a loud knock on the door shattered the stillness. He wasn't expecting anyone. Frowning, Elliot rose from his desk and moved toward the door. When he opened it, he found Marcus, an old friend of Noah's, standing there, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. "Elliot," Marcus gasped, "you need to come with me, now." Before Elliot could ask what was going on, Marcus was already turning to leave, motioning for him to follow. Reluctantly, Elliot did, his heart pounding with a sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. As they exited the building, Marcus didn't speak, but his hurried steps led them to the parking lot where a black SUV waited. Without a word, Marcus opened the door and climbed into the back seat. Elliot hesitated for a moment, but something in the frantic urgency of his friend's demeanor made him follow. Something was terribly wrong, and he needed to know what. The drive was long and silent, the dark city streets outside the window flickering past, as Elliot tried to make sense of what was happening. Finally, they arrived at an imposing mansion on the outskirts of town, its gates high and wrought iron, the structure looming like a shadow in the night. Elliot's pulse quickened. He had seen this place before. Dante Vieira's mansion. It was notorious. Dante Vieira, the crime lord, the man whose name was whispered in fear across the city. Everyone knew his reputation. He ran the underground arms trade, gambling, and any number of other illicit activities. He was a man of ruthless control, and no one crossed him without facing the consequences. Marcus opened the door to the SUV and got out, motioning for Elliot to follow. As they walked up to the mansion's front door, Elliot's mind raced. Was this about Noah? What had his brother done this time? They entered the grand foyer of the mansion, and there, standing in front of them, was Dante Vieira himself. Tall, with sharp, calculating eyes, and an air of cold authority, Dante's presence commanded attention. The man wore a dark suit that looked as though it had been tailored to perfection, and his piercing gaze fell on Elliot the moment he entered the room. "Welcome, Elliot," Dante said, his voice smooth but edged with an icy undertone. "I'm glad you could join us." Elliot's breath hitched. He had heard stories about Dante, the man who had built an empire on fear and violence, a man who had never been known to show weakness. But nothing prepared him for the chill that settled over him in that moment. "What's going on? Where's Noah?" Elliot demanded, his voice shaky despite the anger he tried to hide. "What did he do?" Dante didn't immediately answer. Instead, he motioned to the side where a tall, imposing man stepped forward, holding a thick folder. Dante took the folder and began flipping through it with deliberate slowness, as if savoring the tension. "Your brother made a very poor choice," Dante finally said, his tone casual, though the words carried a weight that made Elliot's heart drop. He thought he could play with the wrong people, get involved in a little arms deal, and walk away unscathed. Dante looked up from the folder, his eyes locking with Elliot's. "But when you play with fire, you get burned." Elliot's stomach twisted. He could barely comprehend what Dante was saying. Noah, his reckless, impulsive brother, had gotten involved with Dante Vieira's world. Had he stolen from him? Made a deal he couldn't pay? His mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was clear. Noah was in deep trouble. "You'll stay with me until Noah does what he needs to do," Dante said, his gaze never leaving Elliot. "Until your brother decides to face the consequences of his actions, you will remain here. You'll be kept safe and well treated, of course, but you'll be here nonetheless. Understand?" Elliot swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He had always protected Noah, always tried to shield him from the consequences of his actions. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. "You can't keep me here," Elliot said, his voice trembling with frustration. "This is kidnapping!" Dante's eyes glinted with amusement. "It's not kidnapping if it's necessary," he replied coolly. "And this is necessary. You'll be a good motivator for your brother. You're the leverage that ensures he comes back to fix this mess." Elliot's anger flared, but he could see the unyielding coldness in Dante's expression. This man was used to getting what he wanted, and it was clear that Elliot was now nothing more than a tool to get to Noah. Without another word, Dante gestured for his men to escort Elliot upstairs to a lavish guest room. The luxury of the room did nothing to ease Elliot's panic. He was trapped in a gilded cage, and Noah's life, possibly his own, was hanging in the balance. As the door closed behind him, Elliot sat on the bed, his mind a whirlwind of thought. How had his brother gotten involved with Dante Vieira's world? And what would happen to them both if Noah couldn't or wouldn't make amends? The mansion was silent, save for the muffled sounds of footsteps outside the door. In that silence, Elliot couldn't escape the feeling that his life, the life he had once thought was so controlled and predictable, had just shattered. His future now depended on the whims of a dangerous man, a man whose heart he could already tell was as cold as the marble floors beneath him. And all of it, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, was because of Noah's reckless choices. Elliot closed his eyes, his heart heavy. He had always been the one to keep things together, to protect those he loved. But now he was the one who needed protection. And he had no idea how he was going to get out of this alive, or what he might lose in the process. Chapter 2. Prisoner of the Past. Elliot paced the length of the spacious guest room for what felt like the 100th time. The room was immaculate, decorated with expensive furniture, thick velvet curtains that blocked out most of the light, and an intricate Persian rug that stretched across the polished marble floor. It was a far cry from the cramped apartment he'd shared with Noah, but the wealth that surrounded him only deepened his sense of unease. Everything about Dante's mansion, from the cold, clinical design to the imposing grandeur of the walls, made Elliot feel like he was being suffocated by his own captivity. The space might have been lavish, but it felt as though the mansion itself was a prison, its grandeur masking a darkness that seemed to lurk just beneath the surface. He couldn't shake the sense of fear, confusion, and frustration that had settled in his chest. Where was Noah? Why hadn't he come for him? Did Noah even know what was happening? The uncertainty gnawed at him, gnashing at his nerves like a wolf circling its prey. The man who had kidnapped him, Dante Vieira, had made it clear that Elliot's role was simple: stay put until Noah did what was needed to repay his debt. But Elliot couldn't stand being stuck in this luxurious prison, unable to do anything to help his brother or himself. For the past few days, Dante had rarely spoken to him. The tension between them hung in the air like a thick fog. Sometimes, the only sound in the house was the distant echo of footsteps down the hall, or the soft clink of silverware during what Elliot imagined were Dante's meals. But Dante had not once approached him for any kind of conversation or explanation. It was as if Elliot was meant to wait, just wait, until Noah appeared or did whatever Dante demanded. The silence in the mansion was deafening. And then there was the fact that Elliot had no idea how to get out. The windows of his room were high up, overlooking a courtyard he had no knowledge of. He didn't know where to go, or if he even had a chance to escape. The mansion was enormous, and while Dante's men rarely interacted with him directly, their presence was constant. They were always watching, always lurking just outside the door, just beyond the threshold of his comfort. The isolation was starting to wear on him. Every creak of the house, every shifting shadow in the corner of his eye felt like a reminder that he was trapped. His thoughts constantly returned to Noah, to what his brother's choices had done to them both. Elliot had always felt responsible for Noah, always tried to keep him safe, but now he was the one who needed saving. The door to his room creaked open, and Elliot froze in place, his heart pounding. A man in a black suit stepped inside, his face expressionless. Without a word, he placed a tray of food on the small desk beside the bed, then turned and left just as quickly, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Elliot sighed, rubbing his temples as he walked over to the tray. The food looked expensive, far more than anything he would have ever bought for himself or Noah. But the fine china and the silver cutlery made it feel like a mockery of his situation. He couldn't bring himself to eat. The thought of sitting at the small desk, pretending everything was fine while his brother was still out there, somewhere, bothered him more than the hunger gnawing at his stomach. Everything about this place unsettled him. The mansion, though grand, felt empty. The servants who brought him food never spoke to him, their faces impassive, their eyes averted as they performed their duties. The mansion's vast halls were silent, save for the distant sounds of music playing from somewhere below or the occasional echo of footsteps. But most of all, it was the absence of Dante that made the place feel oppressive. There was a quiet control that Dante exuded, even when he wasn't present. His presence lingered in the air, in the lavishly furnished rooms, and in the whispered conversations of the servant. It was clear that Dante ruled his world with an iron fist, but Elliot couldn't quite understand why he'd been chosen as the hostage in this game. Elliot wasn't important, at least not in any way that could justify this treatment. He was just the older brother, the one who had to clean up Noah's messes. He was nothing to Dante, except a means to an end. So why keep him locked up in this gilded cage, untouched and unspoken to? Was Dante testing him? Waiting for Noah to do the unthinkable? Dante's coldness was unnerving. He didn't speak to Elliot like a captor. He simply allowed him to exist in his space, without regard, without cruelty, without much of anything. It felt worse than the blatant violence of a man who knew what he wanted. Dante's indifference was a silent, slow torture that Elliot couldn't escape. That was until Dante finally appeared one evening, his figure cutting a striking silhouette in the doorway. He wore his usual tailored suit, his posture immaculate, and his gaze intense, almost predatory. "You've been quiet, Elliot," Dante said, his voice smooth and cold, like it was etched in ice. "I was expecting more of a reaction by now. Aren't you curious about why you're here?" Elliot's pulse quickened, his breath catching in his throat. "I want to know where Noah is," he said, his voice raw, barely able to contain his frustration. "I want to know what you're going to do with him. I want to know what you plan to do with me." Dante's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was nothing warm about it. "Your brother is a fool," he said, his tone almost fond. but there was a cruel edge to it. He thought he could make a deal, walk away, and not face the consequences. But he's still out there, somewhere, trying to figure out how to fix this mess. And you? Dante stepped into the room, his gaze narrowing on Elliot. You'll remain here until I see fit, until Noah decides to be reasonable. Elliot's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. This isn't right, he said, his voice growing stronger despite his rising fear. You're using me as leverage. That's not fair. Dante's expression hardened, his eyes flashing with an emotion that Elliot couldn't quite read. Fair? Dante repeated, almost as if the word was foreign to him. Life isn't fair, Elliot. Your brother took something from me, and now he will pay, but I'm giving him a chance to make it right. The silence in the room grew thick as Dante's words settled into Elliot's mind. He couldn't help the frustration that bubbled up in his chest. The longer he was here, the more he felt powerless. His brother's mistakes had led him here, had landed him in this suffocating cage of wealth and quiet menace. But what if he never saw Noah again? What if Noah never came back? Dante's gaze never wavered from Elliot's, and for the first time since his arrival, Elliot understood the truth. Dante wasn't simply a criminal mastermind. He was someone who had been hurt, someone who had built a world where power ruled, but at a cost. Elliot's chest tightened as he realized he was no longer just a prisoner of the past. He was a player in Dante's world, a world full of shadows, power, and pain. And the worst part was, he had no idea how to escape. Dante turned and walked out, leaving the door open just a crack. Elliot sat back down on the bed, his mind reeling with questions and fear. The mansion around him felt colder, darker than before. The tension between him and Dante was only beginning, but already, Elliot knew one thing for sure: nothing about this would be easy. Chapter 3: A Quiet Conversation. The days had blurred together in the sterile, gilded confines of the mansion. Elliot's sense of time had started to slip away, each hour stretching into the next with nothing to break the monotony, except his growing unease and his frustration with his captivity. He was still trapped in his room, left to eat meals delivered without a word from Dante or his men, and nothing to do but think. Think about Noah, about his own growing sense of helplessness, and about the strange, unsettling presence of his captor. He had begun to notice small things about Dante, things he hadn't caught in their initial encounters. It was in the way Dante held himself, poised and perfectly composed at all times. But there were moments when something would slip. A flash of something deeper, something more vulnerable would flicker in his eyes. Dante was always calm, always calculating, his every word and action a reflection of the immense control he maintained over himself and his empire. But there were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when his mask would crack, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath. Elliot saw it one morning as he passed through the grand hallway on his way to the small garden outside. Dante stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the world beyond. For a fleeting second, his expression faltered, his usually cold eyes clouded with something that resembled loneliness, maybe even regret. It was gone in the blink of an eye, replaced by the indifferent, hard exterior that everyone knew. That brief moment left Elliot unsettled. It was as if he had glimpsed something Dante never allowed anyone to see, the person beneath the crime lord. A man who, despite the empire he had built, carried a weight he wasn't willing to show. It was late one night when Dante unexpectedly entered Elliot's room. Elliot had been lying on the bed, his mind once again consumed by thoughts of Noah. The silence in the mansion had become deafening, and his frustration simmered beneath the surface. He didn't know what he had expected, but the soft click of the door as it opened startled him. He sat up quickly, his heart racing, though he tried to mask his surprise with a carefully neutral expression. Dante stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the faint light spilling into the room. He didn't speak immediately, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Elliot. He seemed different tonight, less controlled, less assured. "I know you have questions," Dante said finally, his voice low, almost tired. "You've been here long enough to know that things aren't as simple as you might think." Elliot sat up straighter, surprised that Dante was speaking to him at all. The Mafia kingpin had hardly addressed him directly in the days since his capture, instead leaving him to his thoughts to the silent. "What do you want?" Elliot asked, his voice guarded but laced with the frustration that had been building for days. Dante's eyes softened just slightly, though his face remained stoic. He stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him with a deliberate motion, as if to seal them off from the rest of the mansion. "I want you to understand," Dante said quietly, walking over to the window where he gazed out into the night. "I never asked for this. None of it." Elliot blinked in surprise. It wasn't the cold, commanding tone Dante usually used. There was a hint of weariness in his words, something that caught Elliot off guard. "You're a crime lord," Elliot said cautiously, unsure of what Dante was getting at. "You built an empire. This is what you wanted." Dante didn't turn to face him, but his jaw tightened and his hands fisted at his sides. There was a brief pause before he spoke again. "You think I chose this life?" Dante's voice was barely above a whisper, raw with emotion. Elliot had never expected to hear from him. "You think I wanted to become the man everyone fears? The one who commands respect with violence and threat?" Elliot's heart skipped a beat at the vulnerability in Dante's tone. It was so unlike the man he had come to know. This wasn't the cold, ruthless figure who had kidnapped him. This was someone else. Someone who had carried a lifetime of pain, perhaps more than Elliot could imagine. What happened? Elliot found himself asking before he could stop himself. Dante stiffened, his gaze hardening slightly, but the moment of openness was still there, beneath the mask, buried just beneath the surface. He exhaled slowly, though he did not immediately answer. Some things are not for you to understand," Dante finally said, his voice quiet and final. He turned back toward Elliot, his expression now closed off, the familiar icy exterior returning in an instant. "You're here because of your brother, and when he's done making his choices, you'll go back to your life. Simple as that." Elliot could feel the tension hanging between them, thick and suffocating. There was so much Dante wasn't saying, so much that he wasn't willing to reveal. The glimpse of emotion, the vulnerability he had shown, was gone, replaced by the cold, unapproachable Mafia boss once again. But even as Dante's walls went back up, Elliot couldn't help but feel a strange pull, a desire to understand the man beneath the persona. Dante wasn't just a villain. There was something deeper there, something that went beyond the cold exterior. "You don't have to keep me here," Elliot said softly, his voice calmer now. "I'm not your enemy. I never was." Dante's eyes flicked to him, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped again. A flicker of something, recognition? Regret? Crossed Dante's features, but it was gone before Elliot could make sense of it. "I'm not a good man, Elliot," Dante said, his voice flat. "I never have been, and I don't expect you to understand. You don't have to like me, but you'll stay here until your brother does what he needs to do." The air between them thickened again, the silence pressing down on them both. Dante's demeanor had hardened once more, but something had shifted in Elliot's understanding. There was more to this man than just the cold, violent crime lord the world feared. Elliot didn't know what Dante's past held, or how he had become the person he was, but in that brief moment, when Dante had let his guard down, Elliot saw something he hadn't expected. A man who had been broken by his own choices, a man who was not beyond redemption. And though Elliot still feared Dante, despite his circumstances, he couldn't deny that there was a strange kind of empathy brewing inside him. A recognition that, despite the darkness in Dante's life, there was a possibility for change. A possibility that, perhaps, not everything was set in stone. Dante's voice broke the silence, cold once again. "Get some sleep, Elliot. You'll need it." And with that, he left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Elliot sat on the edge of the bed, his thoughts swirling with the fragments of what had just happened. Despite the fear that still gripped him, despite his desire to escape, something inside him told him that this was only the beginning. A beginning of understanding. And maybe, just maybe, a beginning of something neither of them expected. Chapter 4. A Dangerous Bond. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next with a growing sense of unease. For the first time in a long while, Elliot found himself caught between two conflicting worlds. His captivity was supposed to be temporary, a mere waiting game until his reckless brother, Noah, returned and settled the mess he had created. But as the hours passed in Dante's mansion, Elliot couldn't shake the unsettling thought that perhaps his time here wasn't just about Noah anymore. It was about something else entirely. Elliot had spent most of his days in solitude, pacing the guest room, gazing out the window, and trying to ignore the gnawing fear in his chest. But now, things were beginning to change. Dante no longer maintained his complete indifference. At times he would stop by, almost casually, and they would exchange a few words, though the conversation was always curt and to the point. Dante kept his distance, still guarded, still cold, but there was a subtle shift. It started with the smallest of gestures. Once or twice, when Dante entered the room, he would linger for a moment before speaking, his eyes briefly locking with Elliot's. For just a fraction of a second, Elliot could see something that wasn't the calculating, ruthless Mafia lord, the man everyone feared. It was a crack in his otherwise perfect facade, and it was almost human. One evening, Dante unexpectedly entered Elliot's room, though this time there was no agenda. The door closed behind him softly, and Dante didn't immediately sit or give any command. Instead, he simply leaned against the wall, arms crossed, as though unsure of what to say. Elliot had learned to keep his guard up, to be wary of Dante's every move. But tonight felt different. The tension between them was palpable, yet something unspoken hung in the air, something almost fragile. "What do you want, Dante?" Elliot asked, his voice soft but tinged with the frustration he still couldn't entirely mask. Dante's gaze softened as he studied Elliot for a long moment, his sharp eyes taking in the faint weariness in Elliot's expression. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice unexpectedly quiet. "About you, about why you're really here." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "You kidnapped me because of my brother. That's why I'm here." Dante shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as he considered Elliot's word. "That's not entirely true," he murmured. "Yes, you are here because of Noah. But there's more to it, more than you realized." Elliot's curiosity flared. Despite the fear that still gripped him, despite his mistrust of Dante, a part of him was beginning to wonder if there was more to this situation than he had first thought. "More to it? What do you mean?" Dante pushed off the wall and paced slowly, his fingers running through his dark hair, his brow furrowed in thought. "You see a man like me, a man who controls everything with violence and fear, and you think you know me. You think I'm just a monster, right?" Dante's voice was low, but there was something raw in it, something vulnerable. "But I wasn't always this way. None of us are born like this, Elliot. We become what we have to be to survive." Elliot watched him, captivated by the uncharacteristic openness in Dante's tone. He didn't know why, but he could sense that Dante was offering him something real, a glimpse beneath the surface. "I didn't ask for any of this," Dante continued, his voice growing quieter as the words seemed to unravel themselves from his tightly held composure. "I didn't ask to be the man I am now, but life doesn't always give you choices, does it?" Elliot's heart clenched as he heard the rawness in Dante's voice. His captor, the dangerous, calculated man who had kidnapped him, was now speaking to him as though he too was a victim of circumstances. Elliot remained silent, letting Dante speak, not sure how to respond, but feeling a pull toward him that he couldn't explain. He had always thought of Dante as a villain, someone who had chosen this life. But now, for the first time, Elliot saw the cracks in the armor. He saw a man who had been shaped by forces beyond his control, someone who had been hurt deeply, just like anyone else. Dante stopped pacing and looked directly at Elliot. His gaze was steady, but there was something in it that Elliot couldn't quite place. I didn't start out wanting to rule the underworld, Elliot. I didn't start out wanting to control people with fear, but it's the only thing I knew how to do, my father. Dante paused, as if the words were hard to say. My father taught me that love only leads to weakness, that trusting people is a dangerous mistake. So, I built walls around myself. I made people fear me, and in return, they gave me control. It's how I've survived, how I've kept from being consumed by the same things that consumed him. There was a long silence as the weight of Dante's words sank in. Elliot found himself at a loss for what to say. He hadn't expected any of this. He hadn't expected this side of Dante. And what happened to your father? Elliot asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. His voice was gentler now, curiosity taking over. Dante's expression darkened, and for the first time, Elliot saw something flicker in his eyes, an emotion that had nothing to do with the Mafia kingpin he portrayed. He's dead, Dante replied shortly, his jaw clenched. I killed him. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The weight of Dante's confession hung between them, heavy and thick, the tension palpable. But Dante didn't seem to expect pity. He didn't seem to want any kind of comfort. He simply let the words linger, allowing them to sit in the silence of the room. Elliot didn't know what to say. He had never imagined that Dante's cold, ruthless persona came from a place of such deep pain. He had thought that the man standing in front of him had built an empire from ambition and greed. But now, he saw that it was much more complicated. Dante had built his empire as a way to survive the scars of his past. He had molded himself into someone incapable of trusting, incapable of letting others in. The silence stretched on until Elliot finally spoke, his voice softer now, almost tentative. I don't understand why you're telling me all of this. Dante met his gaze, the hardness in his eyes softening just a little. Because you're here, Elliot. And I'm not going to pretend I don't notice. You're not like the others I've dealt with. You're not a pawn in my game. You could leave if you wanted to. But something tells me that, like me, you're stuck in the past too. Elliot's pulse quickened at the mention of his brother Noah. He wanted to ask about him, wanted to demand answers about why Dante had kidnapped him, why he had to be a part of this dangerous game. But the words didn't come. Instead, all Elliot could do was stare at Dante, caught between the man who had taken him captive and the one who had revealed his deepest vulnerabilities. There was a growing understanding between them, one that neither of them could ignore. And though it felt wrong, a part of Elliot found himself drawn to the man who had shown him a side of himself that the world never saw. For the first time since his arrival, Elliot found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, Dante wasn't the monster he had always assumed. And as much as he tried to deny it, he couldn't ignore the dangerous bond that was beginning to form between them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Chapter 5: Secrets Unveiled. The days had become a blur of silence and uncomfortable conversations, and yet, somehow, Elliot felt something changing. The tension between him and Dante had shifted, like the quiet tension before a storm, when the air felt thick and electric. Every passing moment, every exchange, seemed to bring them closer, not in the way Elliot had ever expected, but in ways he couldn't quite explain. He had tried to keep his distance from Dante, tried to keep his emotions in check. After all, Dante Vieira was the man who had taken him captive, the one responsible for the wreckage his brother had caused. He should have hated him, feared him, but the truth was, he didn't. Not entirely. The growing bond between them, however strange it was, had begun to pull at the edges of Elliot's carefully constructed walls. Each day, the pieces of Dante's story seemed to fall into place, and with each revelation, Elliot's understanding of the man standing before him shifted. Tonight, Dante had returned to his room. It wasn't unusual for Dante to check on him. He had done so before, though their conversations had mostly been brief. But tonight, there was something different. Dante's expression, usually so unreadable, held an undercurrent of something more, something personal. He wasn't here as a mafia boss or a captor tonight. Tonight, it seemed like he was simply a man, standing in front of Elliot. The door closed softly behind Dante as he stepped into the room, his usual imposing presence softer tonight, almost hesitant. He didn't immediately sit or give any commands. He simply stood there, looking at Elliot, his eyes searching. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable yet not unwelcoming. Finally, Dante exhaled, as though he had been holding his breath. "I think it's time you understand who I am, why I am the way I am," he said, his voice quieter than usual, almost reluctant. "And why I do what I do." Elliot straightened, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Dante to open up to him like this. "I don't understand," Elliot said, his voice laced with confusion and curiosity. Dante sighed and turned away, walking over to the large window that overlooked the mansion's sprawling gardens. He gazed out at the night sky, his silhouette framed by the faint light of the moon. "I was born into a family that valued power above all else," Dante began, his tone distant, as though the words were rehearsed. "My father, Luigi Vieira, was a kingpin of sorts, someone who ruled over the underworld like a tyrant. But he never saw people. He only saw assets, tools, things to control." Elliot stayed silent, his breath catching in his throat. He had never heard Dante speak of his family, never considered that the man before him might have come from such a broken background. Dante paused, his shoulders stiffening as memories flooded his mind. "My father, he taught me how to rule, how to control, how to manipulate. I watched him tear apart anyone who dared to cross him. He never believed in loyalty. He never believed in love." Dante's voice softened, the bitter edge giving way to something more vulnerable. "I was his heir, but he never saw me as a person, just a tool for his legacy, for his power." Elliot listened intently, the weight of Dante's words sinking in. He'd never imagined the life Dante must have lived. It was always easy to demonize someone like Dante, to see him as nothing more than a ruthless boss. But here, in this moment, he saw a man who had been shaped by the harshness of his upbringing, a man who had been groomed to take over a world that didn't allow softness or humanity. Dante's voice dropped to a near whisper. "When I was young, I tried to get close to him. I wanted approval. I wanted love. But my father was incapable of giving either. The day he tried to use me to settle a deal that I couldn't bear, I left. I didn't want to follow in his footsteps, but he had made me who I was, and in the end I became the thing I hated most. I built my own empire, just like him. But it was built on fear, not love, and it became just as cold, just as distant. But love." Elliot's heart softened. This man who stood before him, so calculated, so ruthless, had been made into the person he was by a father who never saw him as anything more than an extension of his own will. Dante had been a victim of his upbringing as much as anyone else. It was a moment of understanding, one that Elliot never thought he would have. Dante turned back to face him, his eyes darker now, but there was a flicker of something deeper there. "I became what I feared, Elliot, and now I can't seem to stop. The empire I built, the power I hold, it's a prison. It's the only thing I have left. It's the only thing I know. And maybe that's why I keep you here. I don't know." He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't want to be like this. I don't want to be him. But here I am. For the first time since he'd been brought to this mansion, Elliot saw Dante as more than just a monster. He saw a man who had been shaped by his past, a man who had been betrayed by the one person he should have been able to trust. Dante wasn't a heartless villain. He was a man carrying the scars of a broken past, struggling to find a way out of the life he had inherited. But as much as Elliot felt a growing sympathy for Dante, there was still the matter of Noah. His brother's betrayal weighed heavily on him. He had always been the one to protect Noah, to pick up the pieces of his mistakes. But the deeper he got into this strange, complex world, with Dante, the more Elliot began to question everything he thought he knew about his brother. Dante's next words sliced through his thoughts. Your brother's involvement in the arms deal is more complicated than you realize. He wasn't just a bystander, Elliot. He's been playing both sides. And he's not just in trouble with me. Dante's voice turned sharp, his eyes narrowing. Noah's been working with rival factions. He's been using you to cover up his tracks. And if he doesn't fix this, if he doesn't make amends for the deals he's made, there won't be a way out. Elliot's heart dropped into his stomach. The betrayal was deeper than he had feared. He had always tried to protect Noah, to believe that his brother wasn't capable of such things. But now, Dante's words shattered that illusion. No, Elliot breathed, his voice tight. Noah he couldn't be involved in something like this. Dante's gaze hardened. I'm not giving you false hope, Elliot. Noah's responsible for this mess. And you're stuck in it because of him. You're here because of his choices. The weight of the truth pressed down on Elliot's chest like a stone. He had always thought Noah needed him, that he was the only one who could protect him. But now, the reality was far darker than he had imagined. Elliot was torn. On one hand, he couldn't ignore the bond that was growing between him and Dante. The understanding, the shared pain, they had become connected in ways he never expected. But on the other, his loyalty to Noah was a force that was not so easily shaken. Could he continue to protect his brother, knowing the full extent of his betrayal? Dante's words echoed in his mind. You're stuck in it because of him. Elliot didn't know what to believe anymore. His heart ached for the brother he had always tried to save, but now he found himself questioning everything. Would he remain loyal to Noah, or would he allow this fragile bond with Dante to grow, despite everything that had come before? The truth had been unveiled, but the choices ahead were far from simple. Chapter 6, Breaking Point. Elliot had spent days, turning the new revelations over in his mind, each thought leading to more questions, more confusion, more hurt. His loyalty to Noah had always been unshakable. For years, Elliot had been his protector, his shield, believing that his younger brother, reckless as he was, could do no wrong. But now, the dark truth of Noah's betrayal gnawed at Elliot, and he couldn't pretend any longer that things were the same. The weight of the lies, the realization that his brother had been playing both sides, had finally broken through Elliot's defenses. He could no longer ignore the truth, and he could no longer be passive in the face of Dante's role in it all. The mansion had never felt more suffocating than it did now. Elliot's feet carried him down the marble hallways, with a purpose he hadn't felt in days, his thoughts racing as his frustration built. Dante, the man who had captured him, the man whose world he had been forced into, had always been the enemy, the figure of cold indifference. But as the days passed, something had shifted between them. Their conversations, their unspoken understanding, had changed him too. Dante wasn't just a monster in Elliot's eyes anymore, and that made the truth about Noah's betrayal even more painful. He found Dante in his study, surrounded by papers, the faint glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows over the room. Dante didn't look up as Elliot stepped inside, his presence unnoticed at first, as if he were lost in thought. Dante, Elliot said, his voice tight with the weight of his emotions. I need to talk to you. Dante didn't flinch or react immediately. Slowly, he placed the papers down and turned in his chair to face Elliot. His expression was unreadable, but Elliot could see the slightest flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of awareness of what was coming. "What is it, Elliot?" Dante asked, his voice low, steady, and almost detached. Elliot's hands clenched at his sides as he fought to control the wave of anger and hurt that surged through him. "I know about Noah, what you said, about him working with rival factions. I know what he's done." Dante remained silent, watching him, waiting. "I trusted him," Elliot continued, his voice cracking with the emotion he couldn't hold back. "I've spent my whole life protecting him. I thought I was the one keeping him safe. But now I don't even know who he is anymore. You're right, he's put everyone at risk. He's put me at risk." Dante didn't interrupt, but his eyes softened slightly. The hardness in his gaze began to fade, just enough for Elliot to see the complexity beneath the surface. Dante knew. He knew exactly how Elliot was feeling. "Do you understand what he's done?" Elliot asked, his voice growing sharper, though the pain in it remained. "He's not just reckless, he's put everything at risk, and Elliot cut himself off, shaking his head in frustration, trying to suppress the tears that threatened to spill. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know who I'm supposed to trust." Dante stood slowly, moving around the desk, his presence now a steady force in the room. He wasn't the calculating criminal Lord Elliot had once seen him as. Tonight, Dante was something else, something more human. "You're hurt," Dante said quietly, his voice soft but steady. "I know. It's not easy, Elliot. I get it." Elliot's eyes snapped to Dante's, his confusion and hurt bleeding through. "No, you don't. You don't get it. You never had someone like Noah, someone you would do anything for, someone who needed you." He took a step toward Dante, his voice rising in anger. "You said I was stuck in the past, that I was holding on to the wrong things, but you don't understand. I'm not just angry at Noah for what he's done. I'm angry because he's lied to me. He's been lying to me this whole time, and now he's put all of us in danger. And I don't know if I can ever forgive him for that." The words felt like they were tearing out of him, but they were the truth. The burden of Noah's betrayal was too much to carry anymore. Dante watched him quietly, as if letting him process it all. Finally, Dante stepped closer, his gaze firm yet somehow empathetic. "The real danger wasn't me, was it?" he said softly, his words sharp and unflinching. "It was the lies, the betrayal. It was your brother. The choices he made have put you here, not me." Elliot's chest tightened, a lump forming in his throat. It was the truth. It was the one thing he had been afraid to admit, but Dante was right. The real danger wasn't Dante. It was Noah's choices that had dragged them both into this world of lies and consequences. "You're right," Elliot whispered, his voice breaking. "It's Noah." Dante's eyes softened, but there was no smug satisfaction in his gaze. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't seeking revenge. It was just understanding. A shared moment of clarity that connected them in a way Elliot hadn't expected. Elliot stepped back, trying to breathe through the emotions swirling inside him. "I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I've been protecting the wrong person, and now I don't even know where to turn." Dante took another step toward him, his voice low but insistent. "You don't have to turn anywhere, Elliot. You don't have to choose between me and Noah anymore. You have a choice. I'm giving you a choice." Elliot looked up, his gaze meeting Dante's, confusion still clear in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Dante's expression softened. "I can't fix the mess Noah has made, but I can give you the freedom to choose your next step. You don't have to stay here with me if you don't want to. When Noah is found, when he fixes his mistake, you can leave. You can go back to your life if that's what you want." He paused, as though weighing his next words carefully. "Or you can stay and see where this connection between us goes. I can't promise anything, but I can promise you that you won't be alone. Not in this." The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. For the first time since arriving in this mansion, Elliot was faced with a decision that wasn't just about survival. It was about something more personal, more complicated. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirl of emotions and conflicting loyalties. He had always thought that his choice was clear: protect Noah no matter what. But now, as Dante's words echoed in his mind, Elliot realized the truth was more complicated than he could have imagined. There was a part of him that longed for the peace Dante offered, for the connection that had slowly, imperceptibly, formed between them. But there was also his brother, the brother he had always protected, the brother whose betrayal still stung. Elliot's mouth went dry as he took in the weight of the decision before him. He had been trapped by his past, by Noah's mistakes, and by his own need to fix things. But now, for the first time, he had a choice. A choice that wasn't dictated by the lies, by the promises, or by anyone else's expectations. The question remained: what did Elliot want? And could he find a way to reconcile the man he had once been with the man he was becoming? The silence stretched on, thick with uncertainty, as both men waited for Elliot's answer. Chapter 7. Unlikely Confession. The silence in the room after their heated argument felt oppressive, like a heavy weight that neither of them knew how to lift. Elliot stood near the window, staring out at the dark courtyard, his heart racing as the emotional intensity of the confrontation swirled in his chest. He had never felt so torn, caught between the loyalty he still felt for Noah and the undeniable pull he felt toward Dante, the man who had once been his captor, and now, something else entirely. In the heat of the moment, Elliot had lashed out at Dante, accusing him of everything that had gone wrong in his life. But in the aftermath of their argument, his anger had subsided, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. The words Dante had said, the truths that had spilled out, rang in his ears. The real danger wasn't me, Elliot. It was your brother. It hurt, but there was a painful clarity to it. What Dante had said about Noah's betrayal was true. The reckless, impulsive actions of his brother had put them all in danger, and Elliot could no longer ignore the weight of that reality. But there was something else, something more that had shifted between them. A shift that scared Elliot just as much as it intrigued him. His gaze flicked to Dante, who stood across the room, his back to him. Dante's posture was rigid, as though he were holding himself together by sheer force of will. The vulnerability that had shown through in their argument seemed to have closed off again, replaced by the cold, calculating figure that Elliot had come to expect. Yet, despite the walls that Dante had built, Elliot could see the faintest tremor in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. Dante was holding something back. "I'm sorry," Elliot said quietly, his voice hesitant. It felt strange to apologize to the man who had held him captive, but the rawness of their earlier confrontation had left him feeling exposed. "I didn't mean to." Dante turned to face him, cutting him off with a sharp gesture. "You don't owe me an apology," Dante said, his voice low, but not unkind. "I didn't bring you here to be sorry. I brought you here because you had a part in this. You're not just a victim of your brother's mistakes. You're here because you're tied to them, tied to him. You're tangled in the web of his lies, just like me." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. Dante's eyes locked onto his, a quiet intensity there that seemed to peel away the layers of indifference. For a moment, Elliot felt as if he was standing in front of someone entirely different. Someone vulnerable. "You think I built this empire because I wanted power," Dante continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think I'm some cold-hearted bastard who enjoys watching people suffer?" He paused, the weight of the words sinking in as Dante exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest visible in the way his shoulders slumped slightly. "But that's not the truth. I did it because I was afraid. I was afraid of being weak, afraid of letting anyone get close, afraid of being hurt again. Because if I let anyone in, if I showed them who I really was, they would have taken everything from me. Just like my father did." The confession hit Elliot like a wave, drowning him in a flood of emotions. He had always seen Dante as nothing more than the ruthless leader of an empire, a man who thrived on fear and control. But, as Dante spoke, Elliot saw the cracks in the facade. He saw the man beneath the violence, the person who had been shaped by betrayal and loss, just as he had been shaped by his own. "My father," Dante continued, his voice distant now, lost in the past. "He was the reason I couldn't trust anyone. He taught me that vulnerability was a weakness, something to exploit, something to use against you, and I believed him." Dante's eyes softened. A faint flicker of something, regret, longing, flashed across his face before he quickly masked it again. "So I built walls. I created a world where I controlled everything, where no one could hurt me. But the truth is, I'm tired, Elliot. I'm tired of being the man I've become." Elliot stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. The revelation was more than he had ever anticipated. The man who had held him captive, the man who had ruled with an iron fist, was now standing before him, admitting his own fears, his own scars. "I've spent my whole life hiding from who I really am," Dante continued, his voice strained. "And now, here I am, telling you this. Of all people telling you, the one person I thought I could control. I'm a fool." Elliot's heart clenched. The walls he had built around his feelings toward Dante began to crumble. The anger, the fear, the confusion, they hadn't completely disappeared, but there was something else growing within him. Sympathy, understanding. For the first time, Elliot realized that Dante wasn't the villain he had thought him to be. Dante was a man who had been broken, a man who had built an empire to protect himself from the very pain he had been taught to avoid. And in that moment, something shifted between them. The cold distance between captor and captive began to blur, replaced by a fragile connection. Elliot took a tentative step toward Dante. "You don't have to keep hiding," he said quietly, his voice filled with an unexpected tenderness. "You're not alone, Dante. You don't have to do this anymore." Dante's gaze softened, though the hardness never fully left his eyes. "You don't know what you're asking, Elliot," he replied, his voice low, tinged with both fear and longing. "I've spent my whole life creating this, building a world where nothing can touch me. I've built this empire on fear, on lies. How can I just walk away from it? How can I trust anyone when I've been burned so many times?" Elliot's heart ached as he closed the distance between them. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Dante's arm, an almost imperceptible touch, but it spoke volumes. "You don't have to be perfect," Elliot said softly. "You don't have to fix everything at once, but you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to stay in this world, Dante. You can choose something else." Dante's breath hitched at Elliot's touch, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The tension between them was still there, but it wasn't the kind that came from fear or control. It was something more, something tender, something fragile. The air in the room grew heavier, the emotions that had been swirling between them finally coming to a head. Dante, the man who had been so fiercely guarded, looked at Elliot with a new vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm not asking you to fix me, Elliot," Dante said quietly, his voice full of quiet longing. "But maybe I could try. Maybe we could try." For the first time since arriving in this mansion, Elliot saw a flicker of hope in Dante's eyes. It was small, fleeting, but it was enough. In that moment, Elliot realized that they were both trapped, not just by circumstances, but by the ghosts of their pasts. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way out together. But there was still the matter of Noah. His betrayal still loomed over them, the truth of his actions still tearing at Elliot's heart. Could he reconcile his brother's betrayal with his growing connection to Dante? Could he continue to protect the one person who had dragged him into this world, while at the same time finding solace in the one person who had shown him something new? The bond between him and Dante was growing, but so was the conflict inside him. The battle between loyalty to his brother and the understanding of the man who held him captive was only beginning, and Elliot wasn't sure where it would lead. Chapter 8: Crossing Boundaries. The days had blurred into weeks in Dante's mansion, and with each passing moment, Elliot felt himself shifting. The walls he had spent so many years building around his heart had cracked, bit by bit, under the weight of the connection he felt with Dante. Every conversation, every silent exchange, every shared look had led them to this point. A point where what they were, who they were, could no longer be defined by simple labels. They were no longer just captor and captive. They were two people, complicated, scarred, yet inexplicably drawn together. The night had fallen quiet, the house still except for the faint rustling of the wind outside. Dante had been unusually distant today, the weight of his empire and the mess of his life pulling him away. But Elliot could feel the tension between them, thick and unspoken, hanging in the air. Elliot sat by the window of his room, his eyes tracing the pattern of the stars above. His mind wandered to the uncharted territory of what they were becoming, unsure if it was real or just another dangerous illusion. Everything between them had started with anger, confusion, and fear, but now it was something else, something more complex. Dante, the man who had held him captive, had shown him vulnerability, and in return, Elliot had softened, understanding the layers of pain and control that had shaped the man before him. Dante wasn't the villain he had once believed. He was someone who had built walls around himself to protect what little heart he had left. There was a knock at the door, pulling Elliot from his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat as the door slowly opened, and Dante stepped into the room. Elliot had expected nothing. No words, no gestures. Dante had been keeping his distance again as though unsure of what came next. But tonight, something was different in Dante's eyes. There was an unspoken invitation in his gaze, one that both terrified and excited Elliot. "You're still awake," Dante said, his voice quieter than usual, almost uncertain. He didn't sound like the Mafia kingpin who ruled with control and dominance. Instead, there was a softness in his tone, a vulnerability that Elliot had only glimpsed in fleeting moments. Elliot looked up at him, his breath catching in his throat. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, his voice betraying the unease he felt. There was so much unspoken between them, so many layers of confusion, but in this moment, it didn't seem to matter. Dante stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind him. He didn't move closer right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, as though hesitating, his gaze never leaving Elliot's. Elliot's heart beat faster. He could feel the tension between them like a live wire, alive, dangerous, and real. What had started as animosity, then shifted to understanding, was now evolving into something even more dangerous, something that both terrified and pulled them closer. "Elliot." Dante's voice broke the silence, soft but filled with an intensity that made Elliot's chest tighten. "What is it?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know what he expected, but he felt the space between them closing with every breath. The air felt heavy with possibility. Dante took a step closer, and without warning he reached out. His hand brushed against Elliot's cheek, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through Elliot's body. For a moment, neither of them moved, the world outside the room fading into nothingness as Dante's eyes searched Elliot's, looking for something, perhaps for permission. Elliot's heart raced in his chest, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into Dante's touch, his breath shallow. "What are you doing, Dante?" Elliot whispered, his voice thick with the emotions he had tried to suppress. "What is this?" Dante's gaze softened, his eyes dark and searching. "I don't know, Elliot," he admitted, his voice rough with uncertainty. "But I can't keep pretending that this, whatever this is, doesn't mean something." His fingers gently traced the line of Elliot's jaw, as though he were memorizing the feel of him, as though this moment, this tenderness, was something precious he wasn't ready to let go of. Elliot swallowed hard, his body betraying him as he closed the distance between them. I don't know if I can trust this, if I can trust you. Dante's expression hardened for a brief second, but there was no anger there, just a sadness that lingered in his eyes. He stepped forward, his hands gently cupping Elliot's face as he leaned in, his breath warm against Elliot's skin. I don't expect you to trust me, not yet, but you don't have to trust me to feel this. I don't expect anything from you, Elliot. I just need you to know that I'm here. I'm not the man I was, and neither are you. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as Dante's lips hovered over his. The words that had been building in his mind, the questions about what this meant, why he felt drawn to Dante despite everything, all fell away in that single moment. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, Elliot closed the distance between them. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though they were both testing the waters of a bond that had been formed out of something much deeper than either of them could have expected. But it quickly deepened, a rawness to it that felt as though it had been years in the making. Dante's lips were warm against his touch gentle yet firm, as if he were afraid of breaking something fragile, something precious. Elliot's hands slid to Dante's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under the fabric of his shirt. In that moment, everything else, the world, the danger, the lies, disappeared. All that mattered was this. The connection between them, fragile as it was, felt more real than anything Elliot had ever known. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, the air between them felt different, more intimate, more fragile. Elliot's mind was racing, his heart conflicted with the growing pull he felt toward Dante. But in the quiet that followed their kiss, he understood something deeper. Dante wasn't just a mafia kingpin. He wasn't just the man who had kidnapped him, who had caused him so much pain. Dante was a man who had been broken, who had built an empire to protect himself, who had buried his own humanity to survive. And in this moment, he had offered that humanity to Elliot. You don't have to choose yet, Dante murmured, his forehead resting against Elliot. I won't push you, but I'm not going to pretend this isn't real. Elliot closed his eyes, the weight of his own feelings crashing over him. I don't know what this means, he whispered, his voice shaking. But I don't want to run away from it either. Dante's hand slid down to rest on the small of Elliot's back, pulling him closer. We don't have to know everything right now, Elliot. We just have to be here, together. In that moment, as they stood there, caught in the quiet tenderness that had developed between them, Elliot realized that the connection he felt with Dante was more than just physical. It was something deeper, something that had formed in the spaces between their pain, their vulnerability, and their shared understanding of what it meant to be broken. For the first time since arriving in this mansion, Elliot felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was living, and whatever path they chose, whatever future they could build together, it was one that started with this moment of crossing boundaries, of allowing themselves to feel something beyond the pain. And for once, Elliot allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a different future. Chapter 9. The truth comes out. The sun had long set, casting shadows across the cold marble floors of the mansion. The air was thick, with a quiet tension, and Elliot could feel it weighing on him as he wandered through the house. After the moment of tenderness he'd shared with Dante, something had shifted. His mind was spinning with new information, conflicting emotions, and a growing realization that the man he had thought he understood was still an enigma. The lines between captor and captive, between loyalty and love, were blurring in ways he had never expected. For the past several days, Dante had been distant again, withdrawn as if contemplating something that he wasn't ready to share. Elliot had hoped for answers, for clarity on what came next, but what he found instead was uncertainty. And then, the letter arrived, delivered to him quietly by one of Dante's men. It was from Noah. At first, Elliot had thought it was just another message, a letter meant to buy time or reassure him that his brother was still out there, still fighting. But the words on the page shattered that illusion in an instant. Noah wasn't fighting. He was running. The letter revealed more than Elliot had ever anticipated. It wasn't just that Noah had been caught in the arms deal, as Dante had suggested. It was that Noah had been actively working with rival factions within Dante's world. He had been siphoning off money, making shady deals with competitors, and had even gone so far as to sell information to other crime syndicates. It wasn't a simple mistake or a reckless gamble. It was betrayal. Noah had been playing a dangerous game of his own, and now, afraid of the consequences, he was on the run. Elliot's hands trembled as he folded the letter, his mind racing. He had always been the one to protect Noah, to shield him from the consequences of his actions, but the truth of his brother's betrayal had crushed that image of him. He had trusted Noah, had believed that he was just a foolish, reckless younger brother who needed guidance. But Noah wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was complicit in the dangerous world Elliot had tried so hard to keep him from. Dante's empire, the very thing Elliot had feared and hated, had been the catalyst for everything. And now, with the weight of the truth pressing down on him, Elliot realized that Noah might never come back, that the brother he had been protecting might be lost to him forever. He didn't know how long he stood there, frozen in the quiet, trying to digest the betrayal that had been slowly unraveling before him. He didn't know what to do with the raw ache in his chest, the sharp sting of disappointment that cut deeper than any of Dante's threats ever had. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, and Elliot looked up to see Dante standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, charged with an understanding that had been built on lies, betrayal, and now, finally, the truth. Dante's voice broke the quiet. "You've read it, haven't you?" Elliot's heart raced as he nodded, unable to find the words. The weight of Noah's actions hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. He wanted to scream at Dante, to accuse him of orchestrating this nightmare, but the truth had become too clear. Noah was the one who had made these choices, who had put everyone at risk. "I'm sorry," Dante said quietly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. There was no trace of arrogance in his voice now, no hint of power or control. He seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable. "I should have told you sooner. I didn't want you to see him like this, but Noah's been running from me for a long time, and now I'm not sure where he's gone." Elliot looked up at Dante, his eyes searching for any sign that he was lying, that this was just another manipulation. But there was none. Dante's face was marked by something close to regret, even guilt, as though the weight of what had happened had begun to settle on him as well. "You were right," Dante continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Noah isn't the person you thought he was. He's been lying to you, to me. And he's been playing both sides for far longer than you realized." The pain in Dante's voice surprised Elliot. It wasn't the satisfaction of a man who had been vindicated. It was the sorrow of someone who had lost control over the very thing he had tried so hard to build. Elliot's breath caught in his throat, his thoughts spiraling. He wanted to feel angry, to lash out at Dante, but the truth had already shattered his world. Noah had betrayed him, and the anger he had once directed toward Dante now felt misplaced. "You didn't have to keep me here," Elliot said, his voice thick with the weight of everything he was feeling. "You didn't have to drag me into this. You could have let me go, let me walk away, but instead, I'm stuck here, caught in the middle of your war and Noah's." Dante's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his expression almost apologetic. "I never wanted you to be part of this, Elliot, but you were never just a pawn to me. Not like Noah, you're different." Elliot felt his chest tighten at the words. Dante had been his captor, his enemy. And yet, in that moment, he was showing a side that was vulnerable and uncertain. It made everything more complicated than it had been before. I never wanted to bring you into this world, into my world. I know what it's done to me. I didn't want to do that to you. Elliot swallowed hard. The part of him that still wanted to escape, still wanted to run back to a life with Noah, before all the lies, before all the betrayal, fought against the part of him that was beginning to understand something deeper. Dante had created this empire out of necessity, out of fear, not because he had wanted to become the villain. And Elliot realized that he too had been shaped by the choices of those around him. Just as Dante had been shaped by the violence of his father's legacy, Elliot had been shaped by his desire to protect Noah, to shield him from the consequences of his actions. And now, with the truth laid bare, Elliot had to decide where he stood. Dante, Elliot started, but the words faltered in his throat. What could he say? Could he forgive what had been done? Could he let go of the years of loyalty to Noah? You don't have to decide now, Dante said, reading the uncertainty in Elliot's eyes. I'm giving you a choice, Elliot. You can leave when Noah is found, when he's dealt with. You can go back to the life you knew. But if you choose to stay here, things will change. You'll no longer be a part of this empire. You'll have a choice of your own, to be with me or leave. The room felt smaller as Elliot took in the weight of Dante's offer. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. The life he had once imagined with Noah, protecting him, keeping him safe, was slipping further away with each new truth. And Dante was offering him something more, something neither of them had expected, a choice. Elliot's heart ached as he stood on the precipice of a decision that would change everything. He had been shaped by his past, by his loyalty to Noah, and by the growing connection to the man before him. But the question remained, what did he truly want from his future? What path would he choose? The truth had come out, and now it was up to Elliot to decide how to move forward. Chapter 10. The Decision. The days that followed the revelation of Noah's betrayal were filled with silence and tension. Dante had kept his promise. He had given Elliot the space to think, to process the truth of his brother's actions. The mansion, once full of the steady hum of servants and the distant bustle of Dante's world, felt quieter now, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for Elliot to make a decision. Noah's whereabouts was still unknown. Dante's men had scoured every possible lead, tracking Noah's movements, but he had vanished, seemingly blending into the shadows of the world he had created. Dante's search had been relentless, but it was becoming clear that Noah might never come back. That Elliot's brother, the one he had spent his whole life protecting, was lost to him. And then, finally, the confrontation came. Elliot was sitting in his room, staring at the quiet stretch of lawn outside the window, when he heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. A knock at the door followed, sharp and purposeful. Elliot didn't need to be told who it was. He opened the door to find Dante standing there, his expression unreadable. His usual cool demeanor was still intact, but there was something in his eyes, an unspoken understanding that this moment had finally come. Elliot, Dante said, his voice calm but edged with something deeper. We found him. The words hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. His heart lurched as he met Dante's gaze. The search for Noah had finally come to an end, and with it, the truth would finally be confronted. Elliot's mind raced. This was the moment he had feared, the moment where he would have to face the reality of his brother's actions, face the consequences of Noah's betrayal, and ultimately decide where he stood. Was his loyalty to Noah still the driving force in his life? Or had it shifted, subtly but irrevocably, to the man who had once been his captor, but was now someone he had come to love? Where is he? Elliot's voice was thick with emotion, though he tried to keep it steady. Not far from here, Dante replied, his voice unwavering. He's holed up in a small cabin on the outskirts of the city. It's a dead end. He's running, Elliot, but he can't keep running forever. Elliot felt a sharp pang in his chest at the mention of Noah's name. The brother he had always protected was no longer the person he had once been. Elliot had always imagined that, in the end, he would have to make a choice, but he had never imagined this: that his brother would betray him, drag him into Dante's world, and then vanish without a trace, leaving Elliot to pick up the pieces of his fractured loyalty. Dante stepped closer, his expression softening for the briefest of moments. "You don't have to do this alone, Elliot, but you have to decide now. You can go to him, face the truth, and try to bring him back, or you can stay here, with me." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they had become. Elliot's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he looked into Dante's eyes that had once been cold and calculating, but were now filled with something deeper, something that felt almost vulnerable. Elliot's mind was spinning. He had spent his life protecting Noah. He had always thought that his brother's mistakes were his to fix, that he was the only one who could keep Noah safe. But now, the truth was inescapable. Noah had betrayed him, had dragged them both into a world of lies and danger. And Dante had been the one to offer him a glimpse of something else, a chance at something new. Elliot stepped back, his chest tight, as his gaze flickered to the door that led outside, to the world that still held Noah. He could go. He could walk away from Dante, from everything they had started, and go after his brother. He could try to mend the broken pieces of his past, hold on to the dream of fixing what had gone wrong. But could he ever fix it? Could he ever look at Noah the same way after the truth had come out? The answer felt painfully clear. Noah wasn't the person Elliot had believed him to be. He was running from the consequences of his actions, not seeking redemption. And Elliot couldn't keep sacrificing himself for someone who didn't care enough to make things right. As he turned back to Dante, something inside him shifted. He could no longer live in the shadow of his brother's mistake. He couldn't keep living a life dictated by loyalty to someone who had abandoned him. He had to make a choice for himself. "I'm staying," Elliot said, his voice firm, though it trembled slightly with the gravity of the decision. "I'm not going after him. Not anymore." Dante's eyes softened, and for the first time, Elliot saw the quiet relief there, as if Dante had been holding his breath, waiting for him to decide. "You've made the right choice," Dante said, his voice steady. But there was something more behind his words, something more than just approval. There was understanding. And in that moment, Elliot knew that Dante, too, had been waiting for this. "I can't go back to the life I had with Noah," Elliot continued, his chest tightening with the finality of the words. "I've spent too long trying to protect him. I've spent too long being someone I'm not. But I can't keep running either. I want something different. With you." Dante stepped forward, his presence closing the distance between them. His hand reached out, cupping the back of Elliot's neck gently, as he looked down at him with a mix of relief and tenderness. "You're free to leave whenever you want, Elliot," Dante said softly, his voice filled with something raw and honest. "But if you choose to stay with me, I'll give you the future you've always wanted, a new beginning. It won't be easy, and it won't be perfect, but we'll face it together, and we'll figure it out." Elliot's heart raced as he met Dante's gaze. In this moment, he could feel the weight of their pasts, the mistakes, the betrayals, the fears. But there was also something else, something new. A chance to build a future that wasn't defined by the mistakes of others, but by the choices they made together. He stepped closer to Dante, feeling the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He had chosen, and though the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, Elliot felt something that had been missing for so long, a sense of belonging, a sense of possibility. "I'm staying," Elliot repeated, his voice strong with conviction. And as Dante's arms wrapped around him, holding him close, Elliot felt the weight of his past begin to lift. They would face the consequences of Noah's betrayal together, but they would also build something new. Something that was theirs. A future that, for the first time in a long while, felt worth fighting for. Together, they would shape their future. And that was enough. Chapter 11. Building a Future. The mansion, once a symbol of Dante's empire, built on violence, control, and fear, had become something else entirely. Its walls, which had once felt cold and oppressive, now held a new warmth. It was still a place of power, but it was different now. The weight of the past still loomed over them, casting long shadows on the future they were trying to build. But those shadows were beginning to fade. Every day that passed, every step they took together, brought them closer to something more, something real. Elliot stood by the window in his room, looking out at the garden. The roses were in bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray skies of the past. The air was heavy with promise, filled with the hum of new beginnings. But the future was uncertain, and they both knew it. Dante walked into the room, his presence like a calm, steady force beside him. He had changed, not just in the way he held himself, but in the way he looked at Elliot. There was still the man who commanded power, who had once ruled an empire. But now, there was something else. Something softer, more vulnerable. Dante had started to let go of the chains that had bound him for so long, and Elliot had too. Elliot's heart still carried the scars of his past, his loyalty to Noah, and the confusion that had clouded his judgment for so long. But there was a sense of clarity now, clarity in the decision he had made, in the path he had chosen. He had let go of the idea of saving Noah, of fixing the broken parts of his brother's life, and in doing so, he had found freedom. "You're thinking again," Dante said softly, his voice low and comforting. Elliot turned to face him, offering a small smile. "I guess I am." Dante moved closer, his eyes never leaving Elliot's face. "You know, it's okay to not always have everything figured out. We're in this together, remember?" Elliot nodded, his gaze softening. "I know. It's just, everything's different now. I never thought I'd be here, with you. I didn't know what I was choosing when I stayed." Dante's expression softened, his hand reaching out to gently cup Elliot's cheek. The tenderness in his touch was something Elliot had never expected from the man who had once been his captor. But here they were, standing together, two people who had been shaped by their pasts in ways neither of them could have predicted. "Choosing each other," Dante said quietly, "is the hardest part. It's the one thing we've both been afraid to do, but we're doing it now, Elliot. We're building something, and that's enough." Elliot's heart swelled in his chest as he looked at Dante, truly looked at him for the first time. He saw not the Mafia kingpin, not the man who had held him captive, but a man who was willing to change, to evolve. He saw a man who had been broken, just like him, but who was trying to heal. And Elliot realized that he too was healing. He was no longer trapped by the past, by the mistakes of his brother, or by the man he had once feared. He was free. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them, but also a sense of peace. They had faced their demons, together and separately. They had chosen to step into the unknown, to trust one another, despite everything that had come before. And in that moment, Elliot understood the greatest lesson of all. Strength didn't come from power or control. It came from love. It came from choosing to face the world together, despite the darkness of the past. "I'm not perfect," Dante murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "And neither are you. But we don't have to be. We just have to choose each other." Elliot reached up to take Dante's hand, squeezing it gently. "We're not perfect," he agreed, his voice steady. "But we're building something that's ours, a future that's ours." Dante smiled softly, his gaze full of something Elliot hadn't seen before. Hope. Real hope. Together. They didn't know what the future would bring, what challenges would come their way. They didn't have all the answers, and their world was far from simple. But they had each other, and for the first time, that felt like enough. Their love wasn't born out of a perfect past or an idealized future. It was born from two people who had been broken by their experiences, who had chosen to face the world together, hand in hand. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. And in that realness was the strength they needed to move forward. As Dante held him, Elliot closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the moment wash over him. There was no going back to the past, no erasing the mistakes that had been made. But there was forward. There was the future they would create together, one step at a time. They had crossed boundaries, faced their fears, and now, for the first time, they had something to look forward to. In the quiet of that room, surrounded by the weight of their pasts and the possibility of their future, they understood that the road ahead would not be easy. But together, they could face anything. Together, they would build something new, something built on trust, on love, and on the understanding that even the darkest pasts could lead to a bright future. And as the days ahead unfolded, both Elliot and Dante knew that, no matter what came next, they were no longer alone. They had each other, and that was enough. That's all for today on Cherry Blossom BL Story. Thank you for watching. What do you think about this chapter? Did you like it, or do you think something unexpected is coming? Comment your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories.